I'm going to try this again. The Wasp Factory. The sacrifice poles. I'd been making the rounds of the sacrifice poles the day we heard my brother had escaped. I already knew something was going to happen, the factory told me. At the north end of the island, near the tumbled remains of the slip where the handle of the rusty winch still creaks in an easterly wind, I had 2 poles on the far face of the last dune. One of the poles held a rat head with 2 dragonflies, the other a seagull and 2 mice. It was just sticking one of the mouse heads back on while the birds went up into the evening air, caw-calling and screaming, wheeling over the path through the dunes where it went near their nests. I made sure the head was secure, then clambered to the top of the dune to watch with binoculars. Diggs, the policeman from the town, was coming down the path on his bike, pedaling hard, his head down as the wheels sank part way into the sandy surface. He got off the bike at the bridge and left it propped up against the suspension cables, then walked to the middle of the swaying bridge where the gate is. I could see him press the button on the phone. He stood for a while, looking round about at the quiet dunes and settling the birds. He didn't see me because I was too well hidden. Then my father must have answered the buzzer in the house because Diggs stooped slightly and talked into the grill beside the button, and then pushed the gate open and walked over to the bridge. On the island and down the path towards the house. When he disappeared behind the dunes, I sat for a while, scratching my crotch as the wind played with my hair and the birds turned to their nests. I took my catapult from my belt, selected a 1/2-inch steely, slightly sighted carefully, then sent the big ball bearing arching out over the river, the telephone poles and the little suspension bridge to the mainland. The shot hit the keep out private property sign with a thud I could just hear, and I smiled. It was a good omen. The factory hadn't been specific, it rarely is, but I had the feeling that whatever it was warning me about was important. And I also suspected it would be bad, but I had been wise enough to take the hint and check my pulse. And now I knew my aim was still good. Things were still with me. I decided not to go straight back to the house. Father didn't like me to be there when Diggs came anyway. I still had a couple of poles to check before the sun went down. I jumped and slid down the slope of the dune into its shadow, then turned at the bottom to look back up at those small heads and bodies as they watched over the northern approaches to the island. They looked fine. Those husks on their gnarled branches, black ribbons tied to the wooden limbs, flew softly in the breeze, waving at me. I decided nothing would be too bad, and that tomorrow I would ask the factory for more information. If I was lucky, my father might tell me something, and if I was luckier still, it might even be the truth. I left the sack of heads and bodies in the bunker just as light was going completely, and the stars were starting to come out. The birds had told me Diggs had left a few minutes earlier, so I ran back the quick way to the house, where the lights all burned as usual. My father met me in the kitchen. Diggs was just here, I suppose you know. He put the stub of a cigar he had been smoking under the cold tap. Turned the water on for a second while the brown stump sizzled and died, then threw the sodden remnant in the bin. I put my things down on the big table and sat down, shrugging. My father turned up the ring on the cooker under the soup pan, looking beneath the lid into the warming mixture and then turning back to look at me. There was a layer of gray-blue smoke in the room at about shoulder level, and a big wave in it, probably produced by me as I came in through the double doors of the back porch. The wave rose slowly between us while my father stared at me. I fidgeted, then looked down, toying with the rest of the black catapult. It crossed my mind that my father looked worried, but he was good at acting, and perhaps that was just what he wanted me to think. So deep down, I remained unconvinced. I suppose I'd better tell you, he said, then turned away. Again, taking up a wooden spoon and stirring the soup, I waited. It's Eric. Then I knew what had happened. He didn't have to tell me the rest. I suppose I could have thought from the little he had said up until then that my half-brother was dead or ill, or that something had happened to him. But I knew then it was something Eric had done, and there was only one thing he could have done which would make my father look worried. He had escaped. I didn't say anything, though. Eric has escaped from the hospital. That was what Diggs came to tell us. They think he might head back here. Take those things off the table. I've told you before. He sipped the soup, his back still turned. I waited until he started to turn around, then took the catapult, binoculars, spade off the table. In the same flat tone, my father went on. Well, I don't suppose he'll get this far. They'll probably pick him up in a day or two. I just thought I'd tell you, in case anybody else hears and says anything. Get out a plate. I went to the cupboard, took out a plate, then sat down again. One leg crossed underneath me. My father went back, stirring the soup, which I could smell now above the cigar smoke. I could feel excitement in my stomach, a rising, tingling rush. So Eric was coming back home again. That was good bad. I knew he'd make it. I didn't even think of asking the factory about it. He'd be here. I wondered how long it would take him, and whether Diggs would know, and whether Diggs would now have to go shouting through the town, warning that a mad boy who set fire to dogs was on the loose again. Lock up your hounds. My father ladled some soup into my plate. I blew on it. I thought of the sacrifice poles. They were my early warning system and deterrent rolled into one. Infected, potent things which looked out from the island, warding off. Those totems were my warning shot. Anybody who set foot on the island after seeing them should know what to expect. But it looked like instead of being a clenched and threatening fist, they would present a welcoming open hand for Eric. I see you washed your hands again, my father said as I sipped the hot soup. He was being sarcastic. He took the bottle of whiskey from the dresser and poured himself a drink. The other glass, which I guessed had been the constable's, he put in the sink. He sat down at the far end of the table. My father is tall and slim. Though slightly stooped, he has a delicate face, like a woman's, and his eyes are dark. He limps now, and has done ever since I can remember. His left leg is almost totally stiff, and he usually takes a stick with him when he leaves the house. Some days, when it's damp, he has to use the stick inside too, and I can hear him clacking about the uncarpeted rooms and corridors of the house, a hollow noise going from place to place. Only here in the kitchen is the stick quieted. The flagstone silenced it. The stick is a symbol of the factory's security. My father's leg, locked solid, has given me my sanctuary up in the warm place of the big loft, right at the top of the house where the junk and rubbish are, where the dust moves and the sunlight slants and the factory sits silent, living and still. My father can climb up the narrow ladder from the top floor, and even my father can't climb up the narrow ladder from the top floor, and even if he could, I know he wouldn't be able to negotiate the twist you have to make to get from the top of the ladder, round the brickwork of the chimney flues, and into the loft proper. So the place is mine. I suppose my father is about 45 now, though sometimes I think he looks a lot older, and occasionally I think he might be a little younger. He won't tell me his real age, so 45 is my estimate, judging by his looks. "What height is this table?" he said suddenly, just as I was about to go to the bread bin for a slice to wipe up the plate. I turned around and looked at him, wondering why he was bothering with such an easy question. 30 inches, I told him, and took a crust from the bin. "Wrong," he said, with an eager grin. 2'6". I shook my head at him, scowling, and wiped the brown rim of soup from inside my plate. There was a time when I was genuinely afraid of these idiotic questions. But now, apart from the fact that I must know the height, length, breadth, area, and volume of just about every part of the house and everything in it, I can't see my father's obsession for what it is. It gets embarrassing at times when there are guests in the house, even if they are family and ought to know what to expect. They'll be sitting there, probably in the lounge, wondering whether father's going to feed them anything or just give them impromptu lecture on cancer of the colon or tapeworms, when he'll sidle up to somebody, look around to make sure everybody's watching, then in a conspiratorial stage whisper say, "See that door over there? It's 85 inches, corner to corner." Then he'll wink and walk off or slide over on his seat, looking nonchalant. Ever since I can remember, there have been little stickers of white paper all over the house with neat black biro writing and on them, attached to the legs of chairs, the edges of rugs, the bottoms of jugs, the aerials of radios, the doors of drawers, the headboards of beds, the screens of televisions, and the handles of pots and pans. They give the appropriate measurement for the part of the object they are stuck to. There are even ones in pencil stuck to the leaves of plants. When I was a child, I once went round to the house tearing all the stickers off. I was belted and sent to my room for 2 days. Later, my father decided it would be useful and character forming for me to know all the measurements as well as he did. So I had to sit for hours with the measurement book, a huge loose leaf thing with all the information on the little stickers carefully recorded according to room and category of object, or go around the house with a jotter making my own notes. This was all in addition to the usual lesson my father gave me on mathematics and history and so on. It didn't leave much time for going to play, and I resented it a great deal. I was having a war at the time. The mussels against the dead flies, I think it was, and while I was in the library poring over the books and trying to keep my eyes open, soaking up all those damn silly imperial measurements, the wind would be blowing my fly armies over half the island, the sea the sea would first sink the mussel shells in their high pools and then cover them with sand. Luckily, my father grew tired of this grand scheme and contented himself with firing the odd surprise question at me concerning the capacity of the umbrella stand or pints or the total area in fractions of an acre of all the curtains in the house actually hung up at the time. I'm not answering these questions anymore, I said to him as I took my plate to the sink. We should have gone metric years ago. My father snorted into his glass as he drained it. Hectares and the sort of rubbish. Certainly not. It's all based on the measurements of the globe, you know. I don't have to tell you what nonsense that is. I sighed as I took an apple from the bowl on the windowsill. My father once had me believing that the earth was a Mobius strip, not a sphere. He still maintains that he believes this and makes a great show of sending off a manuscript to publishers down in London, trying to get them to publish a book expounding this view. But I know he's just mischief making again, and gets most of his pleasure from his acts of stunned disbelief and the righteous indignation when the manuscript is eventually returned. This occurs about every 3 months, and I doubt that life would be half as much fun for him without this sort of ritual. Anyway, that is one of his reasons for not switching over to the metric standard for his stupid measurements, though in fact he's just lazy. What were you up to today? He stared across the table at me, rolling the empty tumbler around on the wooden tabletop. I shrugged. Out walking and things, building dams again? He sneered. No, I said, shaking my head confidently and biting the apple. Not today. I hope you weren't out killing any of God's creatures. I shrugged at him again. Of course I was out killing things. How the hell am I supposed to get heads and bodies for the poles and the bunker if I don't kill things? There just aren't enough natural deaths. You can't explain that sort of thing to people, though. Sometimes I think you're the one who should be in the hospital, not Eric. He was looking at me from under his dark brows, his voice low. Once, that sort of talk would have scared me, but not now. I'm nearly 17 and not a child. Here in Scotland, I'm old enough to get married without my parents' permission and have been for a year. There wouldn't be much point to me getting married, perhaps. I'll admit that, but the principle is there. Besides, I'm not Eric. I'm me, and I'm here, and that's all there is to it. I don't bother people, and they had best not bother me if they know what's good for them. I don't go giving people presents of burning dogs or frighten the local toddlers with handfuls of maggots and mouthfuls of worms. The people in the town may say, oh, he's not all there, you know, but that's just their little joke, and sometimes just to rub it in, they don't point to their heads as they say it. I don't mind. I've learned to live with my disability and learned to live without other people. So it's no skin off my nose. My father seemed to be trying to hurt me, though he wouldn't say something like that normally. The news about Eric must have shaken him. I think he knew, just as I did, that Eric would get back, and he was worried about it, worried about what would happen. I didn't blame him, and I didn't doubt that he was also worried about me. I represent a crime. And if Eric was to come back stirring things up, the truth about Frank might come out. I was never registered. I have a birth certificate. I have no birth certificate, no national insurance number, nothing to say I'm alive or have ever existed. I know this is a crime, and so does my father, and I think sometimes he regrets a decision he made 17 years ago in his hippie anarchist days, or whatever they were. Not that I suffered, really. I enjoyed it, and you could hardly say that I wasn't educated. I probably know more about the conventional school subjects than most people of my age. I could complain about the truth of some of the bits of information my father passed to me, mind you. Ever since I was able to go in to Port Neal alone and check things up in the library, my father has had to be pretty straight with me. But when I was younger, he used to fool me time after time, answering my honest, if naive questions with utter rubbish. For years, I believed Pathos was one of the three musketeers. Flacio was a character in Hamlet, Vitreous a town in China, and that the Irish peasants had to tread the peat to make Guinness. Well, these days I can reach the highest shelves of the house library and walk into Port Neal to visit the other one there. So I can check up on anything my father says, and he has to tell the truth. It annoys him a lot, I think, but that's the way things go. Call it progress. But I am educated. While he wasn't able to resist indulging his rather immature sense of humor by selling me a few dummies, my father couldn't abide a son of his not being a credit to him in some way. My body was forlorn hope for any improvement. So only my mind was left. Hence all my lessons. My father is an educated man, and he passed a lot of what he already knew on to me, as well as doing a fair bit of study himself into areas he didn't know all that much about, just so that he could teach me. My father is a doctor of chemistry, or perhaps biochemistry, I'm not sure. He seems to have known enough about ordinary medicine, and perhaps still have had the contacts with the profession, to make sure that I got my inoculations and injections at the correct times in my life, despite my official non existence as far as the National Health Service is concerned. I think my father used to work in a university for a few years after he graduated. He might have invented something. He occasionally hints that he gets some sort of royalty from a patent or something, but I suspect the old hippie survives on whatever family wealth the Caldums still have secreted away. My family has been in this port of Scotland for about 200 years or more, from what I can gather, and we used to own a lot of the land around here. Now all we have is the island, and that's pretty small, and hardly even an island at low tide. The only other remnant of our glorious past is the name of Port Neal's hotspot, a grubby old pub called the Caldham Kaldame Arms, where I go sometimes now, though still underage, of course, and watch some of the loyal youths trying to be punk bands. That was where I met and still meet the only person I call a friend, Jamie the dwarf, whom I let sit on my shoulders so he can see the bands. Well, I don't think he'll get this far. They'll pick him up, my father said again, after a long, brooding silence. He got up to rinse his glass. I hummed to myself, something I always used to do when I wanted to smile or laugh, but thought the better of it. My father looked at me. I'm going to the study. Don't forget to lock up, all right? Okie dokie, I said, nodding. Good night. My father left the kitchen. I sat and looked at my trowel stout stroke. Little grains of dry sand stuck to it. So I brushed them off. The study. One of my few remaining unsatisfied ambitions is to get into the old man's study. The cellar I have at least seen and been in occasionally. I know all the rooms on the ground floor and the second. The loft is my domain entirely and home of the Wasp Factory. No less, but the one room on the first floor I don't know. I have never even seen inside. I do not know. No.